Welcome La Mesa teachers. It is a pleasure to bring to you another video to help with your collaboration. Last time I spoke to you, we worked on some ideas around restorative justice and some internal work associated with it. Since then, I've communicated with Nadine and she said that the staff is looking for some more concrete examples on what this type of discipline practice could look like in a school and if there are any examples within APS. As far as the examples in APS, there are quite a few, but they are scattered. APS is in a place with bringing in restorative practice and discipline in which we are essentially working on growing individual teachers and teams in using these practices more fluently in their day-to-day classrooms. And while there are schools that would label themselves as restorative justice schools, there really aren't any that have completed a full implementation of it in their community. This is because it is a long process that takes dedication, with most districts laying out plans for individual schools to adopt it on a 3-year schedule. La Mesa isn't even really on year 1. You're in a place of preparing your community to begin, so providing concrete examples, while they can be clarifying, can also limit you to simple action shifts when what's really needed in this stage are deeper mindset shifts. These shifts need to take place first at the individual level, and then it can grow within the community. With that in mind, however, there is a simple way that we can look at restorative discipline that will not only illuminate our understanding, but also help us to change our mindset around behavior, while also gaining a concrete starting place. And just as a side note, before we get started, you will want to have a piece of paper to write on and something to write with. We're going to be doing some activities today that require you to be ready to write and share. All right, let's dive into today's session. In the book, These Kids Are Out of Control by Miller, Cunningham, O'Connor, and Kastenberg, the authors lay out a 3-part method for beginning to bring what they call restorative discipline into schools. They use the term restorative discipline instead of justice because this separates the philosophy of this idea from its use in the criminal justice system. In my mind, it also helps to address a frequent misunderstanding of restorative practices, which is the idea that in this kind of system, there is no discipline, and students can, quote, get away with anything. This can't be farther from the truth, and changing the term to restorative discipline helps to avoid that initial misconception so that teachers can see the role that this mindset shift has in changing behaviors for the better, while also addressing behaviors more effectively. The 3-part system described in the book is based on affective language, restorative circles, and conferences. Today, we're going to focus our attention on the simplest of these 3 things in order to implement them with students. Affective language. You've already heard about circles from Jeffrey Newcomer Miller, and I won't discuss conferences in detail today. So if you'd like more in-depth information on these topics, let me know and I can either set up a PD on these topics or make you some videos to watch independently. Affective language is language that serves as the foundation of the restorative discipline pyramid. It promotes awareness of the self, awareness of how one's actions can affect others, and opportunities for self-correction of behavior before small problems become large ones. I chose this as a starting place for us because it is a method that can be used with high impact, whether you're using it in individual classrooms, grade level teams, or entire school communities. It can be applied by anyone in the community with positive effect and provides the groundwork for restorative circles as well as more formal conferences later on. It also does not rely on a whole school restorative discipline culture to be in place, which is great for schools like yours in which the culture switch has yet to occur on a school-wide level. Last, it is informal and does not require any additional planning or preparation. It is a language shift, not an instructional one or a structural one, and can be used seamlessly throughout your day to both address and redirect unwanted behaviors, as well as to reinforce positive behaviors. Perhaps most importantly, affective language creates an environment that fosters awareness and responsibility for our actions, as well as a culture of empathy, all of which works together to decrease student behaviors as well as the need for more formal discipline methods. There are two kinds of affective language: affective statements and affective questions. Each one has a different purpose, but both promote restorative practices through building capacity for talking through problems and behaviors, as well as getting in contact with emotions and empathy. Let's start with affective statements. Affective statements have the goal of helping students to understand how their actions have affected others by building emotional intelligence and empathy. These statements can reinforce positive or redirect negative behaviors. They also have the ability to help students with behaviors that harm others, as well as behaviors that harm themselves. Affective statements can be put together with 3 simple steps that, with a little practice, becomes quite natural. First, you will self-identify how you are feeling or how you were affected by the behavior. Next, you will self-identify the specific action or behavior you are responding to. Last, bring together steps 1 and 2 into an authentic expression of how you are feeling and how you were affected by the behaviors you are reinforcing or redirecting. Keep in mind that these statements have some guidance. First, focus on the specific behavior, not the worth or judgment of the student performing the behavior. Also, allow students to see the consequences of the behavior. Also, please consider delivering these statements privately whenever possible, and use a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to corrective statements whenever you can. Last, keep in mind too that authenticity is a key in making these statements impactful tools in the classroom. When you're first starting to use affective statements, it is helpful to keep some sentence stems in mind to guide your language. I used to keep statements like this taped to my plan book or a clipboard that I kept handy so that I could easily reference them whenever I was stressed or struggling for language to reinforce or redirect a behavior effectively. Use statements like, "I'm so appreciative of you/your. I'm feeling frustrated by. I am so excited to see. I am angry about. I'm having a hard time understanding. I am uncomfortable when I see or hear." Now, I want to give you a moment to try making some of these statements yourself. In this activity, we're going to do something a little bit different. Normally, we would think about statements that we could use in scenarios with our students. But with things like this, I often find it easier to make it a habit in my classroom if I'm first using it in my own personal and professional life. So today, you're going to think of something that has come up at work, either positive or negative, and use one of the affective language stems to make a statement about it. I know that this might seem like something that is a little bit vulnerable, but when we use this language with students around their behavior, we're putting them into a potentially vulnerable position too. So it's important that we explore that feeling for ourselves as well. First, think of something that has come up at work recently, either positive or negative, and choose a sentence stem that you would like to use. Then, you will write down a statement using that stem. When you're done, take a moment to share out your statements if you feel comfortable doing so. If you don't, I still want you to share how this activity was for you. What did it bring up? Was it meaningful or helpful? Go ahead and pause the video now to write and reflect as a group. I hope that activity helped to clarify what affective statements can do in context. I encourage you to try these statements sometime this week with your classes or with your own peers or family. Remember, this is a time to experiment and establish practices for yourself so that next year you can dive in. So don't be afraid to get your feet wet. Now let's get into affective questions. The goal of affective questions is to prompt our students to reflect upon how their own actions may have affected others and help them to express themselves. This has the added benefit of opening up discourse between the teacher and the student about the situation as a whole, thus providing a deeper understanding of the entire event or problem. Restorative questions can be used in a lot of ways. They can help students reflect on their feelings following being harmed or harming someone. They can also help teachers and students gain a deeper understanding of the conflict or situation, as well as a deeper understanding of the people involved. And they can help to resolve a conflict between two students. Here are some affective questions that you can use in your own practice. I encourage you to stick with these questions because just as sentence stems can be helpful in times of stress, keeping yourself to a scripted set of questions can help keep you more calm when handling a difficult conversation, as well as ensure that the conversation stays focused on affect and empathy. The first set of questions focuses on challenging a behavior. What happened? What were you thinking of at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you've done? In what way have they been affected? What do you think you need to do to make things right? The next set of questions focuses on conversation with a student who has been harmed. What did you think when you realized what had happened? What impact has this incident had on you and others? What has been the hardest thing for you? What do you think needs to happen to make things right? I'm going to read a short scenario to you. As I read, I want you to listen for affective questions, how they're used, and consider the implications of their use. Take notes on what you hear and write down anything that comes to you while listening. In this scenario, the teacher has been using affective language in his classroom for a while, and it is an established practice. Mr. Harris teaches 3rd grade. Today, he gave a literacy lesson to his class on using pictures, maps, and diagrams in books to help with word meeting. After the lesson, the class was directed to begin their learning activities in centers. Jeremiah and Brian sat down together, and Jeremiah began to read aloud to Brian. But after a few minutes, Brian was no longer paying attention to Jeremiah. Instead, Brian was trying to catch the attention of Tiona, who was sitting at the next table. As Mr. Harris approached the two boys, he saw a look of frustration on Jeremiah's face as the student glanced at his partner. Mr. Harris called Brian over and asked him, "What's happening here?" Brian looked at him blankly and said, "Jeremiah is reading to me." Mr. Harris continued, "Have you been listening to him?" Brian responded without making eye contact. "No, not really." Mr. Harris asked Brian, "So what have you been thinking about?" Brian responded, I was just trying to ask Tiona for her green pen." Mr. Harris said, "So what do you think you need to do to make things right?" Brian responded, I probably need to tell Jeremiah that I'm sorry I disrespected him. He's just trying to read to me, and I need to listen to him. I'll get that green pen later." Mr. Harris responded, "That sounds about right to me. Can you please do that?" Brian returned to where Jeremiah was sitting and said, "Sorry, Jeremiah, you were reading aloud to me, and I wasn't even looking at you. I'll listen better now." Jeremiah raised his fist, bumped it against Brian's fist, and opened his book again. Mr. Harris then approached Jeremiah and said, "Jeremiah, I've been listening to you read. You're really doing well sounding out words that are unfamiliar to you. I'm impressed by your persistence in finishing this story." Jeremiah smiled and looked down at the page. He returned to reading again. Brian was listening, and Mr. Harris walked away. Now that you've heard affective questions in action, I want you to explore it for yourself. First, consider a time when you experienced harm because of another person's actions, or when you caused harm to another person. Next, use the affective questions provided. Write what your responses to those questions might be. Last, share your experience with your team. What did this activity bring up for you? Was it meaningful or helpful in some way? What impact do you think affective questions could have in your classroom? Pause the video, reflect, and chat. When I performed this activity myself, I wrote about a time when I had caused harm to someone I worked with, and I found it to be super helpful. I found it impactful to explore being on the side of causing harm because oftentimes we forget what it feels like to be a student in that position. And activating my own feelings in that moment helped me to stay more empathetic with my own students. As I said earlier, I chose affective language as a starting point because it is the foundation for strong practices in restorative discipline. But beyond that, there are many positive aspects of affective language that support its use in the classroom. When teachers practice using affective language, school culture and behavior can improve. Students gain a deeper awareness of responsibility and empathy, and the need for more formal discipline practices decreases. Keep in mind, though, that there is no such thing as an instant behavior fix. Any change is a process, and restorative discipline takes years to fully implement. Over time, affective language will have a positive impact on student behavior and their ability to empathize with others. In this moment, we can use affective language to begin building the foundation for restorative practices and to help resolve behavior problems more effectively. Starting with these questions and statements will take more time to handle behavior at first, but it will result in problems being managed with greater effect. Before I leave, I want to challenge you to change something. Research shows that when a community is unhappy with student behaviors, changing adult behavior is the first place to start. What commitment will you make in changing your behaviors? What aspects of today's work will you commit to practicing in your day-to-day life? What next steps will you take to begin integrating affective language into your classroom culture? As always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, request PD, if you need a partner in thought, or anything else. I hope you enjoyed today's session and have an excellent rest of your week. See you later.